Repurchase Diablo. I already did. What's up, everybody? My name's Scyushi, and today we're going to be doing a starter guide for players that may be uninitiated to the Diablo franchise, or more so Diablo 4. Currently, we have a beta for pre-orders only, but next week on the 24th, we're going to end up having everybody able to play. And the crazy thing is that as of right now, we don't have access to the Druid or Necromancer for gameplay, but they're going to be unlocked during the public beta. In this tutorial, you're gonna notice me jump between topics pretty rapidly, and the reason for this is because I'm trying to edit this in a way that makes sense for each of the different categories of things that I'm going to explain. So for example, in a moment I'm going to talk about character customization, and in the same breath, I'm going to talk about character transmogging. The reason I'm opting in to do this style of tutorial is because I feel like transmogging and character customization fall under the same category. So at the start of the game, the most important thing is you have to pick the class that you want to play, and they have a pretty good overview of what each of these characters can end up doing. Druid uses elemental spells or transformations into a werebear or werewolf. In a way, you could consider this to be the spell sword class of the game, so you can get up close and personal while still using magics. Rogue is your speedy trapster, where you're going to be mostly using your bow, but you can also end up using daggers with imbuements of poison, cold, shadow, and so on and so forth, while also throwing traps down. Sorcerer is pretty standard. You have a whole plethora of different spells that you can choose from, but most of all, it's about the elements. So frost is good for crowd control, pyromancy is for damage, and shock will end up reducing cooldowns, which allows you to do a lot of crits. Necromancer, which is my personal favorite and isn't in this current beta, but will be in the next beta on the 24th, can control an undead army, use bone magic for physical harm with spells, and darkness, which is curses that will keep enemies at bay, and then blood magic, which is a sort of life leech. And then there's the Barbarian, which is your physical bruiser, and seems like they're actually putting the same amount of care and depth to this character as they do with all of the magic characters. So even Walking Arsenal here says that we'll gain damage by using various weapons during combat, which sounds pretty cool to me. I'll end up having an individual character guide for each of these characters, but for today's video, we're just going to select the Barbarian and continue. Right at the start, you can choose the gender of your character, choose the look of your character from a very, very basic palette, but you can also customize it as well. And the customization is pretty cool. There's not that many variations for the face, and then for skin tone, eye color, and even the hair, you know, there's a very limited amount, but it still is very, very much appreciated. And most of all, I like the fact that these tattoos cover the entire body, and in game, you can end up hiding your armor so that you could really show your character's customization. And the thing that's really neat is that this character will actually show up in cutscenes along with the armor that you have equipped. There's also going to end up being the wardrobe, which I think this is really, really cool. So essentially, as you end up selling and dismantling gear, you'll end up transmogging that gear, which allows us to select the style of that gear at any time. And the cool thing is that we can end up choosing various color palettes for them as well. Ensembles is us just saving and loading this specific look, and we can essentially end up unlocking more slots for this further down the line. Let's go for shirtless just for right now, just so I can show you that at any point you can click this button right here to hide the transmog, because I know that a lot of people are probably early on wanting to just look at all of the fancy, beautiful gear. The cool thing is that not only can you transmog all of your armor, but you can also transmog all of your items and weapons as well. Transmogs are also account bound, but they are going to be class locked. And at any point, if you're unsatisfied with your character's overall look, we can just go into the appearance tab and just start changing everything. We won't be able to change our skin color or our hair, but we will be able to change our tattoos, the colors of our tattoos, jewelry, and makeup. Hardcore mode is just that, hardcore mode. If you die with this character, it gets deleted. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but essentially, if you can handle it, you want to go to the highest world tier possible, because it's going to end up giving you a lot more experience and a lot more gold. This is the world tier statue. So again, this is where you'll go to Nightmare and Torment difficulty, which you can see is level 70 plus. This is level 50 to 70, and so on and so forth. Okay, that was a huge information dump, and we haven't even really gotten to experiment with the gameplay itself. So skipping the intro cutscene, we're immediately thrown into the game, and you're gonna notice that it is an ice isometric dungeon crawler. So the entire game is basically doing dungeons and fighting mobs so that you can get various loot. And if you play Lost Ark or Path of Exile, Diablo is kind of the king of these types of games, or at least was back in the day. It literally created this genre of video game. Now, the thing that Diablo 4 ends up doing a little bit differently from these isometric dungeon crawlers is that we are actually going to end up having a dodge, which is, you could kind of consider it the Dark Souls roll-ish. You'll see down here the button that is associated with it, and when we end up doing it, it is going to end up giving us a slight cooldown. If you ever end up getting body block, that's where the dodge comes in, because it allows us to just jump over all of the enemies. Left click base attack, and then all of these abilities we're going to end up slowly unlocking with the very, very impressive skill tree. So again, I'll have another video that's going to highlight each of the individual classes and all of their different skills and so on and so forth. But for today, I'm just going to give you a basic rundown of how this works. So right here, this you could consider to be the core of what all of these abilities are going to end up being. So this is going to end up being our basic attack. So we could have a lunging strike, which is good for closing the gap. We could use bash, which allows us to stun enemies after a few hits. Frenzy, which is most of all utilized when you're dual wielding because there is two-handed weapons as an alternative. And flay, which is going to end up being kind of our bleed build. Now, if we scroll down to the next core ability, you're going to notice that we have to spend a certain amount of skill points in order to unlock this category of skills. This is true for the rest of the skill tree as well. Okay, I swapped over to my mage because he's much higher level just for this part of the tutorial. But the crazy thing about this game is that you can actually associate any of the spells or abilities that you want to your action bar. So you can have it filled with base attacks if you wanted to. And then if we end up clicking skill assignment, you can see each of the different schools of magic and each of the ones that we have associated and unlocked. With the final ability down here being a sort of ultimate ability that I have actually seen people using while out in the world. Now, the cool thing is that you can actually just refund all of your skills and swap them all around as much as you want. And the higher the level you end up getting on your character, obviously the more options it has for you to end up making a wonky build. A quick example of this is I was fighting this boss on my Sorcerer the other day, and I wasn't really into the spells that I was using, so I just did a quick swap in the middle of the battle. Now, one thing that I want to note is that you don't always have to refund all, and eventually it is going to start costing a certain amount of gold to refund your abilities. So let's start beating some of these guys up, and you're going to notice that we're actually building up our Fury, which this is going to end up being the one gimmick of the Barbarian. Each of the characters is going to end up having their own type of, let's call it a mana source, right? So essentially the, Sorcerer, for example, is going to end up having this completely full already. And as you expend spells, it's going to end up draining. Whereas with the Barbarian, we're actually generating it through combat so that we can then spend it on our more powerful abilities. So now let's take the opportunity to go into our personal menu right here, which will allow us to equip gear that we end up finding on the ground. We can end up changing our profile title and so on and so forth. Not really that big of a deal, honestly speaking. But you'll notice that there's a sort function for your inventory, and what I just absolutely love about this inventory system is how clean and sleek it is, because every item in the game is going to end up taking one of these slots, rather than in old school Diablo, a piece of armor might take 4 slots. But we've got separate inventory for consumables, quest items, and aspects. Aspects is going to be something that comes into the play a lot later in the game, and essentially is that when you end up finding legendary gear, which is going to be orange gear, it will end up having certain abilities unique to them that you can essentially end up taking off of them and then putting onto other legendaries. Or you can end up finding aspects by completing various challenge dungeons that you'll find out in the world. By completing this dungeon, we'll end up getting the Druid only aspect of after killing an enemy with Shred, your next werewolf skill generates 20% more spirit, deals 20% increased damage. That essentially is going to end up being the legendary asphyxiation that we can end up placing onto pieces of gear. So now another very important aspect of the game is you can mark all of your gear as junk, which essentially means that when you end up going to a shop, all you gotta do is just right click one of them and it'll sell everything that's marked as junk. But the thing is that you could do that to end up gaining gold, or you can go to the smithy and you can salvage all of your junk, common, magic, rare, legendary items, and so on and so forth, which essentially is going to end up giving you materials that will be used to upgrade your specific weapons. So we could essentially end up using some iron chunks that we either found in the world or got from salvaging items to upgrade this weapon to +5, which essentially ends up giving it a little bit of a stat increase. And you can see that we can upgrade this a total of 2 times, but it is going to be very expensive on our gold reserve. The thing that I want to stress is upgrading gear is mostly just making that current gear a little bit stronger. It's not bringing it up to your gear level. So I wouldn't really recommend upgrading gear until late in the game when you have gear that you're not just constantly swapping out for better items. So now we're going to end up fighting our first boss, and you're going to end up seeing all sorts of televised attacks that will end up going on the ground to signify where the boss is going to end up attacking. This guy might end up being a bit of a challenge for me just because I am playing as the Barb right now. Each of the bosses is going to end up having all sorts of different mechanics, which I think is really awesome, and essentially is going to end up really requiring you to use the dodge function and kind of use your positioning no matter which class you are, just because you can see that he kind of gets stuck in his attack cycle. We can continually end up getting potions generated during certain phases of the boss. So right now he's summoning a bunch of minions, which means I have an opportunity to just lay on the hurt, but I can also just destroy those minions if I want to end up getting more potions. Now, usually when you complete a dungeon, there's going to end up being some sort of an exit nearby. Otherwise, sometimes you can use the leave dungeon emote, or you could just end up using a town portal, which we don't have access to at the moment. This is where we'll take the opportunity to mention that the entire game is essentially going to end up being open world. Now, during the beta, we can only really explore this one area over here. But you'll notice that as you do end up playing through the beta, the main story quest will start to branch off in all these different directions. Now, the thing is that as we end up hovering our mouse over all of these areas, you can actually see the level requirement. So this is kind of how they balance out the open world and keep you from going to areas that you can't handle yet. So in the full game, for example, we might be able to start going towards the dry steppes when we get to level 15, but it's still going to be recommended that we hang out over here in Act 1 just because all of this area is going to end up being a pretty low level requirement versus going down here, which is level 36, 37, level 40, so on and so forth. So when you see something like this, a big yellow glow, it's either going to end up being something related to a story quest, blue will end up being a side quest, or sometimes another hint of yellow is going to end up meaning a world event that you can interact with other players. Right now we're too early on, so we're not seeing any other players, but essentially this game is going to end up playing very similar to Diablo Immortal in that it's kind of an MMO. You'll start to see random people out in the world that you can team up with randomly or not. But then there's also going to end up being stuff like this out in the world, which is going to be random dungeons that you can do. Usually these are going to end up being some sort of a challenge. So in this case, we've got kind of this mini boss here, which ends up having some various affixes to him. So a lot of the elite enemies that we end up fighting in the world will essentially end up having different buffs. You can see this guy has Frozen as one of his abilities, which was those big ice explosions that we saw around us. Another thing you can find in the world is these statues of Lilith, which will end up giving you permanent stat increases. And sometimes you can also end up finding these random shrines, which will end up giving you temporary buffs. In this case, the Conduit Shrine, which is insanely overpowered. The thing is, while you're exploring the map, there's going to end up being kind of a reputation or a renown system. So as you end up exploring more of a specific area, you'll end up getting more and more passive buffs and rewards. In order to see your renowned rewards, you just open up your map and press W or whatever button it shows up here on controller. And then you can see the various rewards that you'll end up getting for completing the various objectives in the region. And if you ever see one of these bad boys on the map, you want to get it right away because this essentially is a fast travel point. The other thing is that when you're out in the world, you could always end up just warping back to town with your town portal. And that essentially is going to end up creating another portal right here that you could go back inside to return to the point that you were last at. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're ever playing in multiplayer, you'll actually end up seeing the portal of your teammate right here. So at any point, you just go to one of these main waypoints and then you just hop in the portal and it'll teleport you to your buddy. Another cool thing that we don't really get to experience in the beta, or at least I haven't gotten a character to that point yet, is that there are mounts in the game. Yes, you can actually end up using mounts out in the open world. Oh, and there's also going to end up being world bosses, which oddly enough, they already advertised that their drops are going to end up being weekly drops, which has me a little bit worried about the amount of time-gated content that we might end up experiencing in this game. I'm sure that there's going to end up being some form of daily quests as well as weeklies and so on and so forth. Now, these little white icons that you end up seeing with the cross in the middle of them is essentially going to end up being a small tutorial quest. So at any point, we can end up bringing out this menu and you can see priority quests, unlock checkpoints or waypoints, right? So essentially, you want to end up completing all of your priority quests because those are going to end up being the tutorial that will introduce you to characters like the Alchemist, where we can increase our potions and so on and so forth. So speaking of potions, you are going to have a limited amount of potions that you consume while you're out in battle, but when you're fighting enemies and opening chests, there is a chance of potions dropping out of those that will end up refilling your flasks. The cool thing is that while you're out exploring the world, you'll come across these plants and you want to make sure that you grab as many of them as you can because this is going to end up being an essential resource that is used to upgrade your potions. So we do actually have enough Galovine in order to upgrade our potions to the next tier, but we're not level 10 yet. And you can see that level 90 is going to end up being the max level because that's going to end up being where we get our last potion. So then there's going to be this merchant, which will actually be the merchant that allows us to dismantle legendary gear so that we can take one of its properties and then apply it to another piece of legendary gear. Now keep in mind, whatever legendary aspect you put on your current piece of gear is going to completely replace the original aspect on that gear. In short, this is a way that you can keep one of your favorite pieces of legendary gear, but then change its abilities to match your playstyle. Up over here is not only going to be the rings and amulets merchant, but more importantly, the jeweler. So essentially when you're out in the world, you can end up getting these gems to drop. And very rarely you'll end up getting gear that will end up having a socketed slot, which allows you to place the gem into that piece of gear. Where the end game becomes an absolute chore in Diablo is that if you end up having enough of these smaller, lower tiered gems, you can combine them into a more powerful gem, and so on and so on and so on. And it just keeps going and going and going and drains tons of your gold, and you need like the best gems for the end game gear. Now, in previous iterations of Diablo, there was runes that would just have set gear bonuses and would not be able to upgrade. And on top of that, there is also legendary gems that would end up having legendary appropriate abilities. Obviously though, in the beta, we're so early game that I can't really show any of that. And then there's also the Curiosity Merchant, which is essentially the gambling merchant. So you'll be able to spend a currency that you'll get from World Crests and Renown and so on and so forth at a chance of getting legendary gear or garbage. While you're out in the world, you might find chests that require a Whispering Key. So if you scroll all the way down, you can see that you can get them right here. Oh, and for any old school Diablo fan, Paragon Levels are in this game right off the bat. Basically, once you end up getting to max class level, that's probably going to be the maximum amount of skill points that you'll be able to spend on your character's build. Paragon levels are going to be additional class levels on top that will give you passive buffs. Now in Diablo 3, Paragon levels would be account bound buffs, so it might end up being the same case for Diablo 4. Now, last but not least, there is going to end up being your stash over here. This is going to be a stash that is shared account wide, meaning that if you end up going out and farming Necromancer gear on your Barb, you could throw it in here and then use it on your Necromancer. And then as you play further into the game, it's going to cost you more and more and more gold to end up unlocking more and more tabs in the stash. Now, a big question on a lot of people's minds coming so fresh off of Diablo Immortal is Diablo 4 going to be pay to win? And frankly speaking, I don't know yet, because the Battle Pass advertises a lot of cosmetic items, but I'm wondering if the lower levels of the Battle Pass will end up including materials and crafting components, because if they do, then that could be argued as pay to win. However, as far as I know, all you can really do with this game in terms of purchasing is just buying the game itself, and then whenever they start having more battle passes. Personally, I highly recommend this game, but I'm a Diablo fan, so I'm pretty biased towards this. The thing is, if you're completely unsure whether this is the game for you, I'd suggest that you wait until the 24th, because the 24th is when you are going to have access to the public beta, which will allow everybody to play the game, even if you haven't pre-ordered it.